for 40 years. I trusted numbers more than people. Numbers don't lie if you know how to read them. People, even the ones you love, can look you in the eye and help a stranger steal everything you've spent a lifetime building. I'm 63 years old, a retired certified public accountant from Camden, Rhode Island. I raised a son, buried a husband, built a career catching financial fraud for other people. And for 16 months, I watched my own son coordinate with a con man who was trying to steal $420,000 from me. I never confronted them, not once. Instead, I kept records, because the day my son repeated a lie, I'd only told him. I knew exactly what I was dealing with, and I knew exactly what to do about it. But let me start from the beginning. From the day I realized what building something actually means. This story starts quietly, but it won't leave you unchanged. Before we begin, leave a comment and tell me, what are you doing while listening? Driving, cooking, or just sitting with your thoughts? Your perspective truly matters in this space. A quick note, some details are fictionalized for storytelling. The lesson is what I hope resonates. Some people spend their whole lives building things. Houses, families, futures. Some people spend their whole lives tearing those things down while smiling at you across the dinner table. I'm Lorraine Mercer, 63 years old, retired CPA who spent 40 years balancing books for small businesses up and down the Maine coast. For 3 years after my husband died, I kept a secret that would change everything. Until one Sunday in September, when I stopped being careful and started being foolish. Lawrence Whitfield, 60 years old with silver hair and a smile that felt like practiced warmth, had introduced himself at the farmer's market 2 months ago as a semi-retired developer. We talked about nothing important, the price of tomatoes, the ferry schedule to the islands, the way Camden Harbor looked different every morning depending on the fog, small talk that felt larger than it should have, probably because I'd spent 3 years talking mostly to myself. I lived in a modest wooden house on Bayview Street, close enough to the harbor that I could hear the boats when I opened my windows. The paint needed touching up. The porch sagged slightly on the south corner. Inside, I kept things simple. Old furniture from my marriage, books I'd read twice, a kitchen that served one person efficiently. Anyone looking would see a widow on a fixed income, careful with her pennies, making do. They wouldn't see the truth I'd hidden since the life insurance check cleared and the retirement account settled, and my late husband's careful investments matured into something neither of us had expected. $1.8 million. I'd told my attorney. I'd told the bank. I hadn't told my son Preston, because Preston had just gone through an expensive divorce, and I knew what desperation looked like. I hadn't told my neighbors, because I'd read enough fraud case files in my CPA career to know that widows with money get targeted. So I lived in my modest house with its sagging porch and drove my 10-year-old sedan and bought tomatoes at the farmer's market like someone who checked prices. And somewhere in those 2 months of small talk, Lawrence Whitfield had made me feel something I'd forgotten existed. Not love. Not yet. Just the possibility that being alone wasn't the only option left. You deserve to enjoy life again, Lorraine. He'd said that Sunday afternoon, sitting on my porch with coffee I'd made too strong. The September air carried salt and the distant sound of someone's wind chimes. Not just exist in this beautiful prison of memories. I should have heard the script in that sentence. I should have heard the practiced rhythm of someone who'd said similar words before. But I was 63 and tired of being suspicious of kindness. So I smiled and nodded and told him I was trying. I know what it's like to be careful with resources, he continued. watching a sailboat tack across the harbor. Building wealth takes discipline. I hadn't told him about the money. I hadn't told anyone except my attorney and the bank. But I'd told him I'd worked as a CPA. I'd told him my husband had been good with investments. Small details that apparently added up to something in Lawrence Whitfield's careful arithmetic. I should have remembered what 40 years of tax accounting taught me. Anything that looks too perfect on paper usually is. That evening, my son Preston arrived with Lawrence for dinner. Preston, 41 and carrying the permanent worry lines of his divorce settlement, appeared at my door with an eagerness I hadn't seen in years. He hugged me, complimented the roast chicken I'd made, asked about my week with genuine attention. It felt nice. It felt suspicious. After dinner, Lawrence set a leather folder on my kitchen table with the careful ceremony of someone presenting something important. I wanted to wait for the right moment, he said, opening it to reveal printed documents with official-looking headers. I've been working on a coastal development opportunity, small marina expansion in Rockland, limited partnership. The window closes Friday, but I wanted to offer you first consideration. Preston leaned forward, hands flat on the table. Mom, Lawrence has been doing this for 30 years. You can trust his expertise. Why was my own son, who barely called me twice a month, suddenly so invested in my financial decisions? The window closes Friday, Lawrence repeated, sliding the papers toward me. These coastal development opportunities don't wait. The returns are exceptional, and frankly, I think you'd benefit from having your assets working harder. I picked up the first page. My hands didn't shake. 40 years of reviewing contracts had trained them not to. Let me read through everything carefully, I said, voice calm and measured. 40 years as a CPA taught me never to sign what I haven't understood. Lawrence smiled. Preston shifted in his chair. They both nodded like this was reasonable, expected, fine. They left an hour later, with promises to call later in the week, with assurances that I'd see how perfect this opportunity was. With the leather folder left behind like a gift. I waited until I heard Preston's car pull away. Then I carried the folder to my home office, turned on the desk lamp, and spread the documents across the surface like autopsy reports. Partnership agreement, capital contribution schedule, development timeline, property assessment, return projections. I read each page twice, once for what it said, once for what it didn't say. These weren't investment contracts. These were irrevocable asset transfer authorizations. The fine print didn't establish my partnership interest. It transferred $420,000 of my assets to a company, trust I wouldn't control, in exchange for distributions that would depend entirely on Lawrence Whitfield's management discretion. The property assessment listed values that didn't match Knox County records. The development timeline referenced permits that the document itself noted as pending approval, which in construction finance means don't exist yet. The corporate seal at the bottom belonged to something called Harbor Development, LLC, and I was absolutely certain I'd seen that name before, somewhere in my old case files. Every number in these pages was lying to me. My coffee had gone cold. The harbor outside my window had gone dark. Somewhere in Camden. Lawrence Whitfield was probably smiling, confident that a lonely widow would sign away nearly a quarter of her carefully hidden inheritance because she wanted to believe that. Someone saw her as more than just a target. He'd made one mistake. He'd tried to fool an accountant. That night, I worked the way I used to during tax season. Coffee in my favorite mug, the one with the crack along the handle that I'd never replaced. Desk lamp creating a circle of yellow light in an otherwise dark house. Documents that wouldn't lie to me twice, not if I asked them the right questions. I started with the property assessment. Lawrence's papers listed a marina development site in Rockland valued at $2.4 million. I pulled up the Knox County Registry of Deeds website and searched the parcel number. Current assessed value, $1.1 million. The property had last sold 3 years ago for $900,000. Someone had inflated the value by more than double. The development timeline claimed construction permits were in final review. I checked the City of Rockland's permit database. No applications filed for that address. No reviews, final or otherwise. The projected returns promised 8% annual distributions starting in year 2. I'd reviewed enough investment scams in my career to recognize the classic signs specific enough to sound credible, vague enough to be unverifiable, optimistic enough to overwhelm caution. But it was the corporate seal at the bottom of the partnership agreement that made my hands go still on the keyboard. Harbor Development, LLC. I knew I'd seen that name before. Not recently. Not in any context that made sense for a legitimate business operating in 2023. I pushed back from the desk, walked to the basement stairs, and descended into the space that still smelled like my late husband's workshop sawdust and oil, and 30 years of accumulated paperwork I'd never been able to throw away. My old case files lived in bankers' boxes stacked against the north wall, organized by year, because even grief couldn't override decades of professional habit. I counted back 8 years, 9 years, and pulled down the box marked 2015 to 2016. 30 minutes later, I found it, a manila folder labeled Harbor Development LLC, Chapter 7, Bankruptcy. I'd done the final accounting when the company dissolved, a failed attempt to convert an old cannery building into luxury condos. The owner had overextended, the financing had collapsed, and I'd been hired by the bankruptcy trustee to reconcile the books before they closed everything down. The company had been formally dissolved in March of 2016, 7 years ago. Someone was using a dead company's paperwork to legitimize a fraud that wouldn't survive 10 minutes of actual due diligence. This wasn't sloppy. This was deliberate fraud by someone who knew exactly what they were doing and assumed I wouldn't check. 40 years I'd spent catching other people's math errors. I never thought I'd need to catch my own son's lie. 2 days later, Preston called and suggested we meet for coffee. He sounded concerned, the way you sound when you're worried about someone but trying not to offend them. We agreed on the Harbor View Cafe downtown, the one with windows that looked out over the water, and tourists who came in smelling like sunscreen even in late September. He was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner booth with 2 cups of coffee ordered and waiting. He stood when he saw me, hugged me the way he had when he was younger, before the divorce and the debt and whatever had changed the math of our relationship. "Thanks for coming, Mom," he said as we sat. "I wanted to check in. You seemed a little uncertain the other night about the investment opportunity." "I'm always uncertain about investments I haven't researched," I said, wrapping my hands around the coffee cup. It was too hot to drink, but I needed something to hold. "I know, and that's good. That's smart. But Mom, I'm just worried you're getting confused by all this financial complexity. At your age, maybe simpler is better. At my age. As if 63 meant I'd lost the ability to read a balance sheet." "I'm not confused," I said carefully. "I'm being thorough." Of course. He leaned back, hands spread in a gesture of understanding. "I just want to make sure you're not overthinking this. Lawrence has been doing this for 30 years. The opportunity is solid. When did Preston start calling me overwhelmed instead of careful?" Before I could respond, someone slid into the booth beside me. My granddaughter Serena, 16 and sharper than anyone gave her credit for, dropped her backpack on the seat and looked at me with eyes that saw more than I'd realized. "Hey, Grandma," she smiled, then glanced at her father. "Dad, didn't know you'd be here." "Just having coffee with your grandmother," Preston said, a slight edge in his voice. "Talking about some financial things." "Cool." Serena turned to me, and her voice dropped to something genuinely curious, not performatively concerned. "Grandma, are you actually happy? Not just okay, but happy?" The question landed differently than anything Preston had said. Real, not scripted. I started to answer, but Preston cut in. "She's fine. Serena, we're just discussing some investment logistics." "Look, Mom," he continued, turning back to me with renewed focus. $420,000 is a significant amount. You should probably let someone younger help you manage it. Someone who understands modern investment vehicles. My coffee went cold in my hand. I had never told him that number, not the exact amount, not even close. The documents Lawrence had left listed the investment as flexible capital contribution, with suggested ranges. The transfer authorization specified the amount only in the fine print buried on page 7. Preston kept talking, comfortable and concerned, about timelines and opportunities and how I shouldn't let this chance pass. But all I could hear was that number, $420,000. Someone had briefed my son before he ever briefed me. The next morning, I drove 15 miles to Rockland with a legal pad, my CPA license, and questions that needed answers only public documents could provide. If Preston knew numbers I hadn't shared, someone had done their homework. It was time I did mine. The Knox County Registry of Deeds occupied a brick building 2 blocks from the harbor, the kind of government office that smelled like old paper and fluorescent lights. The clerk barely looked up when I signed in, which was exactly what I needed: anonymity and access. I started with Lawrence Whitfield's waterfront property, the house he'd mentioned casually over coffee as my place on the harbor. Property records didn't lie the way people did. I pulled the deed history and felt something cold settle in my chest. Lease agreement, month to month. Lawrence Whitfield didn't own that impressive waterfront house. He rented it, and according to the supplementary documents, he'd missed last month's payment. The boat he'd pointed out during one of our walks. That's mine. The sailboat at the end of B Dock showed up in the Maritime Registry as financed through a credit union, 2 months behind on payments, with a lien notice filed 3 weeks ago. His business address, the one listed on the investment documents as Lawrence Whitfield Development, LLC, traced to a UPS store mailbox on Route 1. The wealthy developer who'd courted me owned nothing. He was living on borrowed money and borrowed time. And now I understood why he needed mine. But it was the deeper search that made my hands go still on the archive computer. I'd started looking for Lawrence's past transactions, anything that would show his actual business history. What I found instead were property deed transfers from 3 elderly women, all recorded in Knox County within the past 5 years. Margaret Sinclair, age 72, transfer dated April 2019. Amount $340,000 to Harbor Trust Holdings, LLC. Eleanor Hartley, age 68, transfer dated September 2021. Amount $220,000 to Coastal Investment Partners, LLC. Virginia Oaks, age 74, transfer dated January 2022. Amount $490,000 to Maritime Development Group, LLC. 3 women, 3 different company names, all transfers occurring within 18 months of their husbands' deaths. according to the estate records cross-referenced in the system. "Can you print the full transaction history for these parcels?" I asked the clerk, my voice steadier than my hands. All of them. I wasn't special. I wasn't even unlucky. I was just next in line. By the time I left the registry with a folder full of printouts, October wind had picked up off the water, carrying the smell of salt and diesel. I drove back to Camden and went straight to the public library, to the quiet study room in the back, where I could make phone calls without anyone overhearing. Frances Thornton answered on the second ring. "Lorraine Mercer," she said, her voice sharp the way it had always been, cutting through pleasantries to get to the point. Frances, 67 and still practicing tax law with the precision of a surgeon, had been my colleague when we'd both worked the small business circuit along the coast. "It's been 3 years. This isn't a social call, is it?" "3 widows, Frances," I said without preamble. Same pattern, same timeline, same man. I'm about to be the 4th. Silence on the line for exactly 3 seconds. Then, "Send me everything. Names, dates, amounts." I photographed the documents on my phone and texted them while we stayed on the call. I could hear her keyboard clicking as she pulled up her own databases. "Margaret Sinclair," she said after a moment. "I remember that estate." The family thought she'd gotten confused in her grief, made bad investment decisions. Eleanor Hartley. Jesus. Lorraine. I handled the preliminary work on her husband's estate. She transferred that money 6 months after he died. "Where are they now?" I asked, though I was starting to suspect I knew the answer. "Sinclair's in assisted living in Bangor. Hartley's in a facility in Augusta. Virginia Oakes died last year. Looks like natural causes, but she'd lost her house by then. All 3 of them. Lorraine, all 3 ended up with nothing." How many women had sat where I was sitting, discovering they were prey 3 moves too late? "The shell companies," Frances continued, and I could hear papers rustling on her end. "Different names, but they all trace back to registered agents that don't exist anymore. Classic setup for fraud. He creates the company, uses it for the transfer, then dissolves it before anyone can pursue recovery. By the time the victims realize what happened, there's no entity to sue." "Can we prosecute?" I asked. "With documentation this clean? Absolutely. Federal wire fraud, elder financial abuse, probably mail fraud if he used the postal service." "But Lorraine," her voice shifted, became more serious. "You'll need to lock down your assets first. If he even suspects you're onto him, he'll accelerate. These kinds of operators, once they know the game is up, they grab what they can and run." I thought about Preston mentioning numbers I'd never told him, about Lawrence's casual pressure to sign quickly, about 3 women who'd probably been told the same lies, felt the same loneliness, made the same mistake of thinking someone actually cared. "What's my first step?" I asked. "Come to my office tomorrow morning," Frances said. "We're going to build a case that doesn't just stop him. We're going to make sure he never does this to anyone else." That night, I spread the papers across my desk under the lamp. 3 names. 3 women I'd never met, but now felt connected to through the arithmetic of loss. Margaret Sinclair, Eleanor Hartley, Virginia Oakes. Women who'd been targeted, exploited, discarded. I wasn't the first, but by God, I'd be the last. Building a fraud case requires 2 things: hard evidence that stands up in court, and bait convincing enough to make the predator reveal himself completely. I had Frances working on the legal strategy. Now I needed to work on the trap. That week, I turned my home office into what it had been during tax season, a war room of organized documentation. Lawrence's investment papers spread across one side of my desk, county records and corporate filings on the other. a legal pad in the middle where I documented every discrepancy in my old accountant's shorthand. I started with the signatures. The notarized transfer authorization bore a date of September 12th, the day after Lawrence had first presented the opportunity. I pulled up Maine's notary public database and searched for the name listed Jennifer Hastings. License issued September 28th. 2 weeks after the date on the document, someone had backdated a signature by a notary who hadn't been authorized to notarize anything at the time. The document wasn't just suspicious, it was legally void. I kept digging. The property valuation appraisal. The one claiming the Rockland Marina site was worth $2.4 million. Had been prepared by Harbor Development, LLC, the same defunct company I'd handled in bankruptcy 7 years ago. The same company that had been formally dissolved in 2016. Someone had taught Lawrence how to forge corporate documents, or Lawrence had learned it himself from years of practice. Either way, every piece of paper he'd given me was a carefully constructed lie, designed to survive casual inspection but crumble under professional scrutiny. A CPA's job isn't to trust, it's to verify. And nothing here verified. I photocopied everything. Made notes in the margins documenting the date discrepancies. The corporate seal from a dead company, the valuation that didn't match public records. Built a timeline showing exactly when each document would have been created and why that was impossible. 40 years of forensic accounting training finally being used to protect myself instead of someone else's books. Fraud is a performance. The trick is remembering you're not the only one with a script. Late October brought the first real cold to Camden, the kind that makes you remember winter's coming whether you're ready or not. Lawrence called and suggested dinner at the Waterfront Grill. He said he wanted to check in, make sure I was feeling good about the opportunity. Preston would join us, he added. Just casual, no pressure. I knew what this was. The closing move. Time to either sign or explain why I hadn't. I wore my good sweater. The navy one, with the loose threads at the cuff that made me look a little less put together than I actually was. Drove to the restaurant in my old sedan. Walked in looking like exactly what they wanted to see, a widow who was tired of making decisions alone. They were already seated when I arrived, both of them standing with rehearsed courtesy as I approached. The table overlooked the harbor, boats rocking gently in their slips, sunset turning the water orange and gold. "Lorraine," Lawrence said warmly, pulling out my chair, "you look wonderful." Preston kissed my cheek. Asked about my week with the careful attention he'd been performing ever since this started. We ordered, made small talk. The waiter brought wine I barely touched, and bread I didn't eat. All of it felt like stagecraft, everyone playing their assigned roles. "So," Lawrence said eventually, setting down his fork with practiced casualness, "have you had a chance to review everything? I know it's complex, but I really think this opportunity is perfect for your situation." I let myself look confused, uncertain. Let a small frown cross my face before I spoke. "I was actually going to ask you about something," I said, voice just slightly hesitant. "I might have another $600,000 coming from a trust next month. My late husband's mother's estate. It's finally settling. Do they go together? Should I wait?" I watched Preston's face very carefully, saw the flash of something calculation, excitement, before he smoothed it away. "Mom, that's exactly what I mean," he said, leaning forward. "Let Lawrence handle everything in one portfolio. It's more efficient, better returns." Lawrence nodded, expression serious and concerned. "We could definitely structure it to accommodate additional capital. In fact, larger investments often get better terms, but the current window still closes Friday. We'd need to move on the initial investment first, Then add the trust funds when they come through. I'd spent 40 years being the careful one. Now I was being the careless one. The difference was, I knew which one was real. "Let me think about it," I said, letting my voice waver just slightly. It's a lot to process." They both assured me I had time. Not much time, Friday's deadline hung there like a polite threat, but enough to make the right decision. We finished dinner. They walked me to my car. Preston hugged me goodbye. Lawrence squeezed my hand and told me to call if I had any questions. I drove home, wondering how long I'd have to wait. 2 days. That's how long it took. Lawrence called on a Wednesday morning, his voice carrying that practiced warmth I'd once found comforting and now recognized as simply practiced. "Lorraine, I've been thinking about our conversation," he said. "Have you given more thought to that trust money, the $600,000? If it's coming through next month, we could structure the investment to accommodate both amounts. The $600,000 could really maximize your position." I stood at my kitchen counter, phone pressed to my ear, looking out at the harbor where boats moved slowly through October mist. He'd said it, the exact number, the exact figure I'd only mentioned at that dinner, with Preston sitting right there, listening. "I'm still thinking about it," I said, adding a tremor to my voice that wasn't entirely performance. "There's just so much to consider." Of course, he soothed. "But Friday is really the deadline. After that, the opportunity closes. I'd hate for you to miss out." I thanked him for his concern, said I'd call him tomorrow, ended the conversation with the perfect tremor of elderly uncertainty. Then I hung up and marked the date and time in my evidence log, called Francis, and left a message describing exactly what had just happened. He'd repeated my lie back to me perfectly, the lie I'd only told Preston and no one else. For 48 hours, I sat with that confirmation, letting it crystallize into something harder than anger. Lawrence wasn't just a con man who'd stumbled onto a wealthy widow. He was methodical, patient, and he'd recruited my own son. On November 3rd, I called Frances Thornton. "I need to lock everything down," I told her, "today." Her office overlooked Providence's financial district, all brass fixtures and mahogany shelves lined with leather-bound tax codes. She'd cleared her afternoon calendar before I arrived. "Start with the powers of attorney," Frances said, sliding the first document across her desk. "Every signature you revoke closes a door he thought was open. By Friday, he'll have no legal access to anything." I worked through the stack methodically. Revocation of durable power of attorney. Revocation of limited financial authority. Transfer authorization for the protected trust accounts Frances had established. In my name, only accounts Lawrence didn't know existed. Each signature felt like bolting a door from the inside. "The $420,000 transfer he's expecting," Frances asked. "File the preliminary notice to cancel. Cite suspected fraud. I want it on record before he realizes what's happening." She made a note on her legal pad. "Done. The court filing creates a paper trail. If he tries to access anything, we'll know immediately." I signed the final document, emergency freeze on my Morgan Stanley account, the one Lawrence had so carefully guided me toward using for his fake investment. How long before he notices? Depends how closely he's watching. Could be days, could be hours. Frances leaned back in her chair, studying me with the same sharp assessment she'd once used on IRS auditors. "You're not going to confront him." "No, I'm going to watch." Something flickered in her expression. Approval, maybe, or recognition. That's what accountants do best. All this time, I'd been the one feeling vulnerable. I'd been wrong. The unraveling started 4 days later. I was having lunch at Portofino, The Italian place on Thames Street where Lawrence and I used to meet, when I saw him at the bar. He was on his phone, turned away from the dining room, but his shoulders had that rigid set I'd learned to recognize. Tension. Desperation masked as confidence. His voice carried just enough for me to catch fragments. Told you the funds are clearing this week. A pause. No, I understand the payment's overdue, but... The bartender glanced at him, then away. Everyone pretending not to notice. Lawrence ended the call, ordered a drink he couldn't quite afford, and checked his phone 3 times in 2 minutes. When he finally turned, he didn't see me in the corner booth. I watched him leave, walking with that practiced confidence that no longer reached his eyes. Over the next week, the facade continued cracking. I didn't follow him. I didn't need to. Newport was small enough that news traveled, especially when someone like Lawrence Whitfield started coming apart at the seams. The Harbor Club called to verify his membership status before hosting a charity event I'd mentioned attending. We need to confirm Mr. Whitfield's account is current, the events coordinator said carefully. It wasn't. I drove past his waterfront rental on Harrison Avenue, the one he'd casually mentioned owning, and saw the notice posted on the door. Bright orange, visible from the street. 3 months behind on rent. Eviction proceedings initiated. The calls to my phone increased in frequency. Lawrence's voice on my voicemail, asking about dinner plans, about whether I'd reviewed the harbor development documents, about my timeline for the investment he needed. Each message a little less smooth, a little more urgent. I've been thinking about our conversation, he said in the 5th message, about the trust you mentioned for your granddaughter. I need to know if you're committed to this opportunity. This deal requires commitment from both of us. The 6th call came at 9 p.m. on a Thursday. I let it go to voicemail. Listen, I need to be honest with you. I'm in a time-sensitive situation here. The harbor development closing got moved up, and if we don't act by next week, we'll lose our position. I need that commitment. Lorraine. I need to know you're serious about this. I played the message twice, listening past the words to what they revealed. He wasn't asking about my commitment to an investment opportunity. He was begging for access to money he'd already counted on. Money he needed not for a development deal, but for creditors closing in, for rent he couldn't pay, for the expensive life he'd been financing on promises and lies. Francis called on Friday afternoon. Did you hear about Camden Country Club? What about it? Lawrence's membership was suspended 6 months ago. Non-payment. He's been telling people he's a member, but he hasn't had access since April. I thought about all those careful mentions of golf games, board meetings at the club, the casual invitation to join him for dinner there sometime. Another prop in the performance. Another expensive thing he'd use to make himself look successful while everything behind the curtain was collapsing. He'd presented himself as a lifeboat. Turned out, he was the one drowning. The final call came Sunday evening. I was in my kitchen, the same place I'd sat reviewing those harbor development documents that had started everything, when my phone lit up with his name. I answered this time. Lorraine. His voice had lost its practiced warmth. What remained was naked urgency. We need to talk about the investment, about your commitment. I've been patient. I've given you time to consider, but I need an answer. Are you in or not? I listened to his final call, heard the desperation he could no longer disguise behind practiced charm, and understood completely. The man who'd courted me, who'd called me isolated and alone, who'd promised to help me navigate my complicated finances, he hadn't been my savior. I'd been his. Understanding Lawrence had been strategic calculation. Confronting Preston about his role in targeting his own mother would require something harder, facing the kind of betrayal that doesn't come from strangers. I drove to his apartment Tuesday evening, unannounced. The folder on my passenger seat held 3 weeks of documentation, phone records, timeline analysis, the $600, 000 trust trap that proved coordination between my son and the man trying to steal from me. Preston opened the door in sweatpants and a faded college shirt, surprise flickering across his face before settling into wariness. "Mom, what are you—" "We need to talk." I walked past him into the small living room. "About Lawrence Whitfield." He closed the door slowly. "What about him?" I set the folder on his coffee table, opened it to the phone records. 17 calls to Lawrence's number between August and October, all before you mentioned his name to me at that dinner in September. I was trying to help you find good investment advice, that's all. Then why did you call him 17 times before you ever mentioned his name to me? Silence filled the room like smoke. I flipped to the next page. October 19th. I mentioned to you, only you, that I was considering a $600,000 trust for Serena. October 21st. Lawrence brought up the exact same figure, unprompted. He called it an ideal investment threshold. Preston sat down heavily. "Mom, how much was he paying you?" His face went pale. Not surprise. Recognition that the game was over. "How much?" Preston. $50,000. His voice barely carried. "From the 420 transfer. He said it was a finder's fee, standard practice for helping him steal from your own mother." Preston's hands shook. "I'm drowning. Mom, the alimony, the rent. I thought you had enough that you'd never even notice. I thought it wouldn't hurt you." I looked at my son, this man I'd raised, whose college I'd paid for, whose wedding I'd helped finance, 41 years old and still making desperate teenager calculations. "You thought I had so much money that $420,000 wouldn't matter. You have almost $2 million. Dad left you. Your father left me exactly $1.8 million after 43 years of marriage and 6 years of cancer treatments insurance. Didn't cover. I spent 17 months managing his care, watching him die by degrees." My voice stayed level. "And you thought that money we built together, that I was preserving for Serena's future? You thought that was just sitting there, waiting for you to take a cut." Preston's face crumpled. "I pay $4,800 a month in alimony. Every month. My salary barely covers it and rent. I can't save. I can't breathe. I can't—" He stopped, choking on words that wouldn't fix anything. Your child betraying you for money feels different than a stranger trying to steal it. One is crime. The other is erasure. I closed the folder. Lawrence is bankrupt. The real estate investor persona, the harbor development deal, the country club membership, all performance. He needed my money to pay his creditors, and you helped him get close enough to take it. I didn't know he was. You didn't ask. You saw $50,000 and stopped thinking. Before I reveal what Preston's admission meant for the legal case, are you still with me? Comment A if you think this was pure desperation, or B if you think Preston knew exactly what Lawrence really was. Add one short reason so I can see how you're reading this betrayal. A quick note, some details ahead are adapted for emotional impact, though the core truth remains. If dramatized elements aren't for you, you're free to stop here. I left Preston's apartment with his written statement not to punish my son, but because I needed every piece of evidence to stop Lawrence completely. Preston had admitted the coordination, the finder's fee, the timeline. In his desperation to justify himself, he'd given me everything Frances would need. 3 days later, I sat across from Frances Thornton while she reviewed the complete evidence package my forensic research, the victim pattern, the backdated signatures, and Preston's confession. With Preston's admission and your documentation, you have ironclad standing to void this before it executes, Frances said. The premeditation is clear. We can file cancellation with the county and prepare fraud reports for the district attorney. How long do I have? Frances looked up, and something in her expression made my stomach tighten. How long? The transfer documents you signed have a built-in execution timeline. Standard practice for real estate investments, a review period before the transaction becomes legally binding. She pulled up a calendar. You signed November 2nd. The binding date is December 12th. I counted in my head. 10 days. 10 days. After that, the transfer becomes legally binding and recovery gets exponentially harder. We file the void notice tomorrow morning. 10 days. How much damage can a desperate man do in 10 days when his last option just locked every door? Frances began drafting paperwork, official cancellation notice, preliminary fraud filing, emergency asset protection orders. Each document, another lock on a door Lawrence thought was wide open. What if he finds out before the filing goes through? He will find out. The county clerk notifies both parties when a transfer is voided. He'll get notice within 48 hours of filing. And then, Frances met my eyes with the steady assessment of someone who'd seen desperate people make desperate choices. Then we see exactly who Lawrence Whitfield becomes when he loses his last chance at survival. She slid the filing papers across her desk. Timeline highlighted in yellow, 10 days until the fraudulent transfer became legally executable. 10 days before Lawrence could potentially force the transaction through if he moved fast enough. I signed the void paperwork with the same steady hand I'd used to sign tax returns for 40 years. But I knew Lawrence Whitfield wouldn't go quietly into bankruptcy. The worst news sometimes arrives in an email with no subject line at 11:47 p.m. And I stared at the county clerk's automated notice on my screen with the cold clarity of someone watching a trap close too fast. 2 months had passed since I'd signed the void notice with Frances. 2 months of silence from Lawrence after the county had served him with cancellation papers in mid-December. I'd thought the quiet meant surrender. I'd been wrong. The automated notice was clinical in its language. Application for expedited processing approved. Corrected documentation submitted February 6, 2024. Completion signatures verified. Transaction execution date 48 hours from approval. I read it 3 times before the implications settled. Lawrence had submitted new documents, corrected documents, with forged completion signatures. He'd fast-tracked them through someone at the county office, bypassing the standard review period that would have flagged the contradiction with my void filing. The $420,000 transfer was set to execute in 48 hours, before my legal challenge could be formally processed. He'd found a way around the timeline. I sat in my home office at 47 Bayview Street, the house too quiet around me, and felt something close to despair. I'd been so careful. I'd documented everything, filed correctly, followed every legal procedure Frances had outlined. And Lawrence had simply circumvented it all with forged signatures and what had to be a corrupt clerk willing to expedite fraudulent paperwork. My hands were shaking as I reached for my phone to call Frances. 11:47 at night. But this couldn't wait until morning. Lawrence would have the money transferred within 2 days, and once it moved, recovery became exponentially harder. He knew that. He was counting on it. Then my hand stopped halfway to the phone. Wait. The originals. The unsigned copies from September. I never gave them back. I set the phone down and turned to my filing cabinet, the 4-drawer steel monster that had followed me through 40 years of tax, seasons, and client audits. Second drawer, labeled Personal 2023. My fingers found the folder immediately. Harbor Development Review, September 2023. Inside were the original documents Lawrence had given me that September afternoon when he'd first pitched the investment opportunity. Blank signature lines, no completion dates, just the template of a fraud he hadn't executed yet. And paper-clipped to the front page, my own handwritten note with the date I'd received them. September 17th, 2023. I'd kept them because that's what accountants do. We keep originals. We timestamp everything. We never assume we won't need proof later. 40 years I'd kept records. 40 years of never throwing away an original. Finally, it mattered. The documents Lawrence had just submitted to the county claimed completion signatures dated October 2023, before my void filing. But I held proof they were blank in September. And if his corrected documents showed my signature on lines that had been empty when I'd received the originals, that wasn't just civil fraud anymore. That was forgery. That was federal wire fraud. I called Frances at 11:52 p.m. She answered on the second ring. Voice alert. I saw the county notice. I was about to call you. I have the unsigned originals, I said, from September, time-stamped in my files. Silence on the line. But I could hear her thinking. That changes everything, Frances said finally. Meet me at my office tomorrow morning, 8 a.m., and bring those documents. I arrived at Frances's office on Main Street at 7:45 the next morning. The unsigned originals in a document protector, my hands steadier than they'd been at midnight. Frances's receptionist waved me straight through to the conference room. Frances was already there, coffee brewing, but she wasn't alone. There was a woman I didn't know sitting across the table, mid-70s, with careful posture and eyes that had learned wariness the hard way. Frances gestured me to a seat. Lorraine Mercer, this is Eleanor Hartley. She reached out to my office yesterday afternoon through the Elder Law Network. Eleanor Hartley extended her hand. 72, I'd learn later. A retired tax accountant from Providence. One of Lawrence's 2021 victims who'd lost $340,000 to a scheme she'd been too ashamed to report publicly. Mrs. Mercer, Eleanor said quietly, I heard through attorney channels that someone was building a case against Lawrence Whitfield. I wanted to help. Frances slid a folder across to me. Eleanor's documentation matches yours perfectly. Same company seal, same backdating pattern, same forged corporate filings. She has banking records, copies of the fraudulent transfer documents, even correspondence where Lawrence used identical language to what he used with you. I opened the folder, scanning the documents inside. Harbor Development, LLC. The same logo, the same phony investment timeline, the same promise of guaranteed returns. The only differences were the dates 2021 instead of 2023, and the amount, $340,000 instead of $420. You lost all of it, I asked Eleanor. Every dollar. By the time I discovered the fraud, the corporate entity had dissolved. The bank accounts were empty. And Lawrence had moved to a new identity in a new city. She met my eyes. I didn't report it. I was mortified that I'd been fooled. I'm a CPA. I spent my whole career catching financial fraud for other people, and I missed it when it happened to me. A CPA doesn't gamble on memory. We keep copies, timestamps, paper trails that outlast lies. But you kept the records, I said. Every single one. Eleanor's smile was thin but certain. He counted on shame keeping me silent. He was half right for 3 years. Then I heard he was trying it again. Frances pulled both sets of documents toward her. Eleanor's from 2021, mine from 2023. With her testimony and your unsigned originals, we don't just void the transfer, we prosecute federal wire fraud, pattern of behavior across multiple victims, forged documents, interstate financial crimes. This becomes a criminal case. I looked at the papers spread across the conference table. 2 victims, 3 years apart, identical fraud patterns, same forged corporate seal, same backdating technique. Lawrence Whitfield had run this scheme before and thought he'd perfected it. He'd made one mistake. He tried to cheat 2 accountants. The notary office conference room on a February morning held 6 people and 16 months of evidence that would decide whether justice came methodically or not at all. And I had never been more certain which it would be. Coastal Title and Notary on Main Street in Camden wasn't designed for drama. Gray carpet, beige walls. A conference table meant for routine closings where signatures transferred houses and everyone walked away satisfied. Today, it would serve a different purpose. Lawrence arrived at 9 a.m. exactly, dressed in the expensive suit that no longer quite concealed desperation. He carried his leather portfolio, ready to finalize what he thought was an inevitable transaction. Frances sat to my right, 2 banker's boxes of documentation at her feet. Preston stood near the door, pale and silent. I'd asked him to witness this, and Serena sat beside me, 16 years old and steady, her hand in mine. Lawrence's practiced smile faltered when he saw the number of people in the room, the volume of paperwork Frances was arranging on the table. I thought this was a standard closing, he said carefully. It is, I replied, just not the one you were expecting. Frances opened the first folder. Mr. Whitfield, this meeting was scheduled to process a $420,000 investment transfer. Instead, we're here to present findings from a fraud investigation and file formal criminal complaints with the district attorney. Lawrence's expression went carefully blank. I don't understand. You will. I pulled the first set of documents toward me, the unsigned originals from September, still pristine in their protective sleeves. These are the originals you gave me in September, unsigned. You never asked for them back because you thought I'd destroyed them. I slid them across the table. Lawrence didn't touch them. Next, I continued. Eleanor Hartley's case documentation from 2021. Identical fraud pattern. Same corporate seal. Same backdated signatures. She lost $340,000. She's willing to testify. Frances added Eleanor's folder to the growing stack. Mrs. Hartley contacted my office after hearing through the elder law network about another potential victim. She preserved complete records. This is a misunderstanding, Lawrence said, strain breaking through his practiced calm. I can explain the processing timeline. Can you explain why the notary signature is dated 3 weeks before she was licensed? Or why Harbor Development LLC has been defunct since 2016? Silence. I continued, methodical as a tax audit. Forensic document analysis confirms the signatures on your corrected submissions were backdated. The corporate seal belongs to a company dissolved 8 years ago. The investment timeline you presented was physically impossible. Frances placed another folder on the table. And we have a recorded admission from Preston Mercer detailing your coordination, the finder's fee arrangement, and the timeline proving premeditation. Preston's face went red. But he didn't leave. He'd agreed to let his statement be used. Whatever reconciliation we might eventually reach would start with this, with him facing what he'd done. He'd spent months making me feel small. I'd spent those same months making him provable. Lawrence looked at the documents spread before him like evidence at trial, which they would become. His carefully constructed persona, the successful investor, the helpful advisor. The man who understood complex finance was disintegrating under the weight of paper trails and timestamps. "You can't prove criminal intent," he said finally, voice thin. "I don't have to." Francis pulled out the final investigative report. The pattern across multiple victims establishes intent. The forged documents establish federal wire fraud. Your expedited processing attempt in February establishes consciousness of guilt. The district attorney will handle the rest. She slid a formal complaint across the table, already signed and dated. "This files with the state prosecutor this afternoon. Transfer voided. Assets frozen pending investigation. Criminal inquiry opened." Lawrence stared at the complaint, and something fundamental shifted in his expression. Not anger, not defiance, just the hollow recognition of someone who'd finally hit a wall he couldn't charm his way past. "You seemed confused," he said quietly, "isolated. You asked basic questions about investment structures. I was a certified public accountant for 40 years. My voice stayed level, almost gentle. I handled corporate audits, forensic investigations, fraud detection. Every basic question I asked you was building documentation of your misrepresentations. Every confused conversation was recorded. Every timeline inconsistency was cataloged. I watched understanding settle over him like ash. I was never your target, Lawrence. You were my case file." Serena's hand tightened in mine. She'd been silent through the entire presentation, but I felt her shoulders straighten. Francis gathered the criminal filings. Evidence secured. Case transferred to prosecution. But I had one more document. "One more thing," I said, pulling a navy folder from my bag. "Francis filed this trust 2 weeks ago. Serena, this is yours." I handed the folder to my granddaughter. She opened it slowly, scanning the legal language until she found the numbers. $420,000, Serena read aloud, voice breaking. "Grandma, that's exactly what he wanted to take. Now it's protecting exactly what he tried to harm. Your future, secured, irrevocable. Revenge is temporary. Legacy is what you leave when the predator is gone." Serena turned to me, tears streaming, and wrapped her arms around my shoulders, over her head. I saw Preston's face crumple, grief and shame, and something that might eventually become pride. His mother had turned his betrayal into his daughter's protection. Lawrence sat across from me, finally silent, finally seeing what had always been true. He'd presented himself as the expert, the advisor, the man who understood complex finance better than a confused widow. But I'd never been confused. I'd been an auditor for 40 years. He thought I was the target. He was wrong about that, too. The strange thing about justice is that once you stop holding up someone's lie, gravity does the rest. And I watched Lawrence Whitfield's carefully constructed life collapse over the following weeks, without lifting another finger. I didn't have to destroy him. I just had to stop pretending he was something he wasn't. The first call from Francis came a week after the notary office meeting. District Attorney filed federal wire fraud charges this morning. Eleanor Hartley and 2 other previous victims are pursuing civil recovery suits. He has no assets left to seize. I stood in my kitchen with the phone pressed to my ear, looking out at the harbor where Lawrence's leased sailboat had once been docked. It was gone now, repossessed by the marina 3 days earlier. What happens to him now? I asked. Prison. Bankruptcy. Both. His choice was always his own. Over the following weeks, I watched Camden's small-town gossip network do what it does best: dissect a scandal. The local paper ran a careful headline: "Longtime developer under investigation for elder fraud." People who'd envied Lawrence's waterfront house learned it was rented, 3 months behind on payments. The country club quietly confirmed his membership had been suspended since the previous summer. I didn't participate in the gossip. I didn't need to. The truth was doing its own work. Francis called again in mid-March. Creditors seized the house contents yesterday. Furniture, art, electronics, all leased or financed. None of it paid off. The waterfront lifestyle was performance art. And Lawrence moved to a motel on Route 1, his attorneys trying to negotiate a plea deal. But with Eleanor's testimony and your documentation, federal prosecutors aren't interested in negotiation. I thought about the man who'd sat across from me at Portofino last fall, projecting confidence and success, while his entire life collapsed behind a facade of borrowed luxury. He'd worked so hard to seem wealthy, all that energy maintaining an illusion. I didn't destroy him, I said quietly. I just stopped pretending he was something he wasn't. Sometimes that's the same thing, Francis replied. For men like Lawrence, being seen clearly is the worst thing that can happen. Revenge is exhausting. Truth is patient. I chose patience. The investigation continued, without requiring much from me. Eleanor's testimony, the forensic evidence, Preston's recorded admission. The case built itself once the foundation of lies was removed. I'd spent 40 years as an auditor learning that you don't have to force truth. You just have to document it clearly enough that it can't be ignored. By late March, Lawrence Whitfield had become a cautionary tale Camden would tell for years. But I'd stopped paying attention. Justice was proceeding methodically through proper channels, and I had more important things to focus on, like the knock on my front door on a Thursday afternoon. Preston stood on my porch at 47 Bayview Street, hands in his pockets, looking younger than his 41 years. "Can we talk?" I stepped aside to let him in. We sat at the kitchen table, the same scarred oak surface where I'd helped him with homework 30 years ago, where I'd listened to him explain his divorce, where I'd made him coffee the morning after his father's funeral. Memory has weight in familiar places. Preston didn't ease into it. I looked at you and saw money instead of my mother. There's no excuse for that. I'm sorry doesn't cover it, but it's where I have to start. I watched my son struggle with words that should never have needed saying. His face was drawn, older than it had been in November. Whatever shame and consequence he'd been carrying showed in the lines around his eyes. "Why did you do it?" I asked. Not accusatory, genuine question. "Because I was drowning and you seemed like you had so much that you'd never even feel it." He met my eyes. "Because I underestimated you. Because I let debt cloud every ethical instinct I should have had. Because Lawrence made it sound reasonable, and I wanted it to be reasonable because I needed the money." $4,800 a month, I said, referencing the alimony he'd mentioned. $4,800 that's legally owed, morally justified, and financially crushing. Preston's voice cracked. "But that's not your problem to solve. Mom, it never was. I made you into my problem when you should have just been my mother." I poured us both coffee from the pot I'd made before he arrived. Folgers, the same brand I'd been buying for 40 years. Some things stay simple, even when everything else gets complicated. Forgiving your child doesn't mean pretending they didn't betray you. It means loving them anyway, while remembering They can. I forgive you, Preston. The words came easier than I'd expected. But forgiveness isn't forgetting. You broke something that takes time to repair. I know. He wrapped both hands around the mug, needing something to hold. What do I do? You live honestly. No financial talk for a year. We rebuild on truth, or we don't rebuild at all. He nodded slowly. 1 year. No asking for money, no investment advice, no discussing your finances. No discussing money, period. We find something else to build a relationship on. Serena. Maybe. Dinners where we talk about books or politics or anything except dollars. You show me through actions that I'm your mother again, not your inheritance strategy. And after a year, we see who we've become to each other. If you've kept the boundary, if trust has started rebuilding, we reassess. I reached across the table, touched his hand briefly. I love you enough to forgive you. I respect myself enough to not pretend this didn't happen. Preston's eyes filled, but he didn't look away. Thank you for not giving up on me completely. You're my son. I don't know how to give up on you completely. I squeezed his hand once, then let go. But I know how to protect myself while you figure out who you want to be. Preston left through the front door the same way he'd entered it, as a child, uncertain, but hopeful. I watched him go, felt the weight of 16 months lift slightly, but not completely. Forgiveness was given. Trust would be earned. Spring came to Camden Harbor the way truth comes to complicated stories. Slowly, then all at once, carrying the smell of salt air and the promise that what you build honestly lasts longer than what you build for show. 3 months had passed since the notary office meeting. 3 months since Lawrence's fraud became public record. Since Preston's apology at my kitchen table. Since I'd signed the trust documents that transformed attempted theft into protected legacy. The weight of those 16 months had lifted gradually, like morning fog burning off the water. May brought warmth to 47 Bayview Street. I sat on my wooden porch overlooking the harbor, watching sailboats cut white lines across blue water. The house felt right-sized again, no longer too big for one person, just mine. Serena arrived at 2 p.m., carrying her backpack and a thermos of iced tea she'd made herself. 16 going on 30, her mother used to say. And it was true. My granddaughter had her grandfather's steady eyes and my habit of watching carefully before speaking. She settled into the wicker chair beside me, poured 2 glasses of tea, and waited. She knew I'd asked her here for a reason. I handed her the envelope I'd prepared. Heavy cream stationery, her name in my best cursive across the front. I wanted you to have this, about the trust fund, about everything. Serena opened it carefully, unfolded 3 pages of blue ink on white paper. My handwriting. The same script I'd used for 40 years of tax returns and client letters. She read silently while I watched the harbor and gave her space to absorb it. The letter explained what I hadn't said at the notary office, how the money Lawrence targeted had become her educational trust, how the amount that specific number he'd chosen now represented not what someone tried to take, but what no one could ever touch, how transformation works better than revenge. Serena's voice was quiet when she finally spoke. This money was meant to destroy you. Now it protects you. That's not revenge. That's transformation. That's the part I needed you to understand, I said. Lawrence Whitfield spent months trying to make me feel small, confused, dependent. He wanted me to believe I needed him to navigate my own finances. But the truth was always simpler. I knew exactly what I was doing. Francis had called last week with final updates. Lawrence pleaded guilty to federal wire fraud, facing 5 to 7 years. Eleanor Hartley and 3 other victims were pursuing civil judgments against his remaining assets, which totaled less than $30,000. The man who'd presented himself as a millionaire developer would leave prison with nothing but the criminal record he'd earned. Preston was rebuilding slowly. We'd had dinner twice, once in April, once 2 weeks ago. No financial discussions, just careful conversations about Serena's college plans, about books we were reading, about learning to be family again without the weight of expectations neither of us could carry. Trust takes longer to build than destroy. We had time. Some people spend their lives being loved. Some spend their lives being true. Only one survives being alone. "Grandma," Serena said, setting the letter in her lap, "what if I'd lost you? What if he'd succeeded?" I reached over and took her hand. "You couldn't. Not to him. Not to anyone. You can only lose people who were never really yours. But if he'd taken the money, then I'd still be here. Poorer, yes. Angrier, probably. But the parts of me that matter to you, those aren't attached to bank accounts. Those are built from years of work and choices and becoming someone I could respect when no one was watching." A gull called overhead, riding thermals above the harbor. The sound was sharp and clean, cutting through the afternoon like truth through careful lies. Serena read further in the letter, her finger tracing lines. "You write here that Grandpa left you $1.8 million, but you're leaving me something they can't forge or steal." "The inheritance your grandfather left me was money," I said. "Real money, earned over 43 years of marriage and building a life together. But what I'm leaving you is something they can't forge or steal, knowing your worth without anyone's permission." Serena was quiet, absorbing, 16 years old, sitting on the edge of understanding something it had taken me 63 years to fully learn. "When I was building the case against Lawrence," I continued, "I wasn't trying to destroy him. I was protecting what mattered you. The future. The truth about who I actually am. Not the confused widow he saw, not the easy target. Just someone who knows how to read a balance sheet and refuses to pretend otherwise." The breeze shifted, carrying the smell of salt and seaweed and the peculiar sweetness of coastal roses blooming in my neighbor's garden. Spring smells like possibility when you've survived winter. When you're my age, Serena, you'll know the only inheritance that matters is who you became when no one was paying attention. Serena set the letter down carefully, treating it like the valuable thing it was. "Can I keep this? It's yours. The trust fund is secured. Francis has all the legal paperwork. But the letter is the part I actually wanted you to have. The money pays for college. The words explain why you never needed saving in the first place." She leaned over and wrapped her arms around me, careful and fierce, the way teenage girls hug their grandmothers when they're trying not to cry. I held her and looked out at the harbor, at the boats returning to dock as afternoon stretched toward evening. Some people spend their whole lives building things. Others spend their lives building the illusion of things. I'd spent 63 years building something quieter, a life where my value didn't depend on anyone's ability to see it clearly, steal it completely. Lawrence built an empire of lies that collapsed the moment I stopped pretending to believe them. Preston built a justification for betrayal that crumbled when I offered forgiveness instead of permission to forget. And I built evidence, documentation, truth, things that survive scrutiny because they're real. We sat together as afternoon became evening, harbor lights beginning to blink awake, the letter resting between us like a bridge between generations. Some people build empires, Some build illusions. I'd spent 63 years building something quieter. What you are when no one's watching is what no one can take away. And to you listening to my story, remember this: your worth isn't measured by what someone tried to take from you. Looking back, I could have confronted Lawrence the moment I suspected fraud. I could have cut Preston off when I discovered his betrayal. But that's not the revenge story I wanted to tell. I chose documentation over drama because truth outlasts anger. Don't make my mistake of staying silent too long, but don't underestimate strategic patience either. This family drama taught me something I wish I'd known at 20. You can forgive someone and still protect yourself. You can love your child and refuse to let them use you. The people who truly respect you will never ask you to choose between your boundaries and their comfort. I believe God allowed this trial to teach me that self-worth isn't selfish, it's survival. Preston is rebuilding trust slowly. Serena's future is secured, and Lawrence learned that not every widow is confused. The lesson isn't about revenge. It's about knowing yourself clearly enough that no one else can define you. If this revenge story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had to rebuild trust after family drama? How did you handle it? Please share this with someone who might need to hear it. And if you want more stories about finding strength in difficult family situations, subscribe to Karma Family Stories. Your support means the world to me. Thank you for staying until the very end. As a reminder, some elements of this story were fictionalized for emotional impact and reflection. The core message about self-worth and boundaries is what I hope you carry forward.